Hi guys, this is Shivadi. Welcome back to the Spring Framework Interview Question and Answers Session 2. So explain in detail about the Spring IOC container. So in Spring, application context is represented as a Spring IOC container, and it is responsible for instantiating, configuring and assembling the beans whichever available in the application in the XML configuration file. Now, the container gets its instruction on what objects to instantiate, configure and assemble by reading the configuration metadata. For example, in this case, I have the module XML and module 2 XML. Then what container is going to do is it starts reading these two files, and then in the file we are going to define the beans on what basis it has to create. Then container will read the each bean definition, and it will start instantiating that object, and then it is going to configure and then assemble. Why it requires assemble is if there is any dependency objects are there, then first child object has to uh, instantiate and then parent object, then only the injection will happen properly. So container will be taken care of all the dependencies injected properly, then only first it will create a child objects first and then parent objects by injecting the child object into the parent. Now if you see the diagrammatic representation here, configuration metadata, either it can be a XML based or the annotation based or the Java bean based. Any metadata it can be considered as a configure metadata. And then once it reads this configure metadata, and based on the bean definition, the Spring container creates the object and then configure. Finally it is going to assemble, and then finally it is going to produce the output. Whenever you call any particular bean, already container will have the object readily available, and it is going to return to the application. So for example, if you see here, employee object emp equal to, it is going to, I am just casting to the employee object, and then context dot get bean of employee. So this emp we already configured in the XML configuration metadata. Hence it is going to return as the employee, and also it will be taken care of completely life cycle of this bean, when to it has to create, and when, that means from the initiation to till destroy, the container now have the complete control over the life of a particular bean. So that is the main responsibility of the Spring IOC container. Even you can consider Bean Factory is also a IOC container, but the basic difference here is Bean Factory is only have the functionality for creating the bean and wiring. Other than that, it does not have any further features. That is the reason always recommended to we can use with the application context as a Spring container. So let us go with the next question. So the next question is, what is the Spring Bean and its properties? So far we are thinking about we are expecting that Spring container will maintain the Spring Beans. Now let us see what is meant by Spring Bean. Before we go with the Spring Bean, let us understand what is the normal Java Bean. So a Java Bean is a Java class that has the no arg constructor, and it should be serialized, and should provide the setter getter methods for the properties. Then we call as a Java bean. Now if you come to the Spring Bean, any Java class or the POJO in the framework that initializes through the Spring container is called as a Spring Bean. That means any normal Java POJO can be a Spring Bean if it is configured to the initialized via container by providing the configuration metadata information. So any bean which is created through the Spring configuration file, that means XML configuration file or the Java based or the annotation based, any bean which is created through the container we call as a Spring Bean. So Spring Bean has the few set of the properties. Let us go ahead and see what are those properties. So the properties are class. So this is the fully qualified name of the bean, that is POJO. and then name or the ID, which is going to be unique across the XML configuration file. And then it is going, then scope basically defines the scope of a particular bean. We are going to see that concept in few minutes. And then constructor arguments. Whenever you use the constructor dependencies, then dependency injection, then we go with the constructor arguments. And properties, in order to go with the setter based dependency injection, or you want to set the properties, then go with the setter properties. And auto wiring is a feature where the dependencies automatically taken care by the container if you provide a some configuration. So if you want to provide that functionality, you can enable this auto wiring property. And lazy initialization mode, by default what happens is Spring Container, by default whenever container is starting, automatically it is going to create the objects for the each bean which is configured in the XML configuration metadata. But if you don't want to initialize as part of the container, as part of when container is starting, then you can provide this this lazy initialization you can set as a false. Then it will never load. That means whenever you create an object, at that time only the object will be initialized. That is what it means. An initialization method, before bean is creating, if you want to create some if you want to invoke some functionality, you can go with the init method. And as part of the destroy the bean, if you want to provide some functionality, then you can go with the destroy method. So these are the properties which are available for the Spring Beans, and based on these properties, whatever you are providing, the container will take care of the life cycle of that particular bean. And then the next question is, explain the bean life cycle in the Spring. Now so far we have seen Spring Container and we have seen the properties of the bean. Now we need to understand how bean exactly have the life cycle from the creation to the till it destroys. Now as we know that application context is the container. Now this container is going to read the configuration related bean definitions from the XML configuration metadata. For example, in this case, let us consider spring.xml. So the first step is the Spring Container reads the bean definitions from the configuration file, and then it is going to create an instance or object of a bean using the Java reflection. And if you set any properties are mentioned, then they are also applied. If the property set itself as a bean, that means it has a dependency on the another class. So it is going to create an object for that class, and then it is going to set that value. And if the bean class implements the bean name aware interface, then setBean method will be called by passing the name of the bean. And if the bean class implements the bean class loader aware interface, then the method setBean class loader method will be called by passing the instance of the class loader object that loaded in this bean. And if the bean class implements the bean factory aware interface, then the method setBeanFactory will be called by passing an instance of the bean factory object. If there are any bean post processor object associated with the bean factory that loaded the bean, then method post process before initialization will be called even before the properties for a bean are set. And then if the bean class implements the initialization bean interface, then the method after property set will be called once all the bean properties defined in the configuration file are set. If the bean definitions in the configuration file contains a init method attribute, then the value for the attribute will be resolved to a method name in the bean class, and that method will be called. The post processor after initialization method will be called if there are any bean post processor attached for a bean factory object. If the bean class implements the disposable bean interface, then the method destroy will be called when the application no longer needs the bean in reference. And if the bean definition in the configuration file contains a destroy method attribute, then the corresponding method definition in the bean class will be called. So this is the complete life cycle of a bean, and based on your implementation, few steps it is going to skip. Otherwise, if you are implementing all these bean aware interfaces, then it is following all these steps. Finally, it is from the initialization phase to till it is going to be destroy. These are the steps. And the next question is, what are the scopes of a bean? Basically, scope define the life cycle of a particular bean. So when in the case of Spring Framework core module, we have basically two types of the scopes. One is singleton, another one is the prototype, and the remaining scopes comes when we are working with the application context. That means it is a web application context. These scopes will come. First one is singleton. So singleton, it is by default. If you don't provide any scope, then it is a singleton. The singleton scope tells that there is a single bean definition to the single object instance per Spring IOC container. That means basically only one object is going to be defined for the one bean definition throughout the life cycle of this bean per container. So once it reads the bean definition, it is going to create a singleton object, and how many times you are going to call, then it is going to return the same object. Prototype means scope a single bean definition to the any number of the object instance. That means if you specify the scope as a prototype, every time you get a bean, then it is going to return a different, that means it is going to create a new object and then it will return. And then request, this scope a single bean definition to the life cycle of a single HTTP request. That is, each HTTP request has its own instance of a bean created of the back of a single bean definition. So only valid in the context of WebAware Spring application context. So this scope is only for the WebAware application context level. Similarly for the session, so scopes a single bean definition to a life cycle of a HTTP session. Again, it will be valid for the WebAware Spring application context. And application, so again, this is going to be create a single bean definition to the life cycle of a servlet context, and it is applicable for the WebAware Spring application context. And WebSocket, it is going to scope a single bean definition to the life cycle of a socket, and valid only context of the WebAware Spring application context. So in the case of Spring Framework core module, singleton and prototype we are going to use. By default is singleton, and prototype, if you specify, then every time you request for a bean, it is going to create a new object, it is going to return. But let us consider there is a two bean definitions in the file for the same class, then it is going to create a two singleton objects. That is the reason Spring container always create a bean per bean definition. Even if you create a same bean definition multiple times, it is going to create a one object for each definition. And the next question is, how we are going to, for example, in your application, we have the multiple XML based configuration file, then how we are going to use it. So I explain about the Spring config or the application context.file, and as application can have the multiple Spring config XML files. So Spring application context.xml or the Spring configuration file basically contains the all the bean definitions at one place, and this is a source for the Spring container. So Spring container is going to read the XML based configuration files, and it is going to create a objects. And in Spring project, you can have a multiple configuration XML based configuration meta files, and if you have multiple, then by using the import keyword or the tag, we can import those files here. For example, let us have application 1, application 2, application 3 I have. Then by using the import tag, we can import those XML files. Then what happens is whenever Spring Container is reading this configuration files, then it notes that there are multiple configuration files are applicable for this project. Then it starts reading all these configuration meta files. Okay, and then we have the another concept of a what are the bean wiring, auto wiring, and different types of auto wirings in Spring framework. So first thing is bean wiring. So whenever we have a dependence object, for example, previously we have seen where we have a employee has a dependent object as address. Now, bean wiring is nothing but whenever you have a address, whenever you have a dependency object, then it is your responsibility to make sure that wire them properly. That means you need to tell the container that this is a dependent object needs to be go for the particular as part of the another bean definition. So that is called as an wiring. Wiring is nothing but basically mapping of a dependent object properly to the correct one. Okay, auto wiring is nothing but auto wiring feature is just something that Spring Framework will be taken care of injecting the dependent objects based on below modes actually. So we have by default it does not have any auto wiring, hence you need to explicitly set the wiring based on the ref tag, either it might be a constructor based or the setter based. You need to provide the constructor dependency injection. You need to provide arg constructor arg and a name, and then you need to specify the ref tag. Similarly for the setter based, you need to specify property and ref tag. But if you don't want if you don't want to manually mapping the auto wiring, then Spring Framework will have an option where Spring Container will be taken care of automatically mapping the dependent objects. So by default it is no. That means bean references must be defined via ref element. Changing the default setting is not recommended for the larger deployments because specifying the collaborator explicitly gives a greater control and clarity. To some extent, it documents the structure of the system. So it is for the larger project, it is always recommended that you need to turn off this feature. If for the smaller project, you can go ahead and enable it, but that is up to you because in the long run, because from the maintenance perspective, if you are going with the auto wiring feature, then it might be a little bit difficult to understand the dependent objects. Now let us see what are the different type of auto wiring we are available. Then first one is by name. So auto wiring by property name, Spring look for the bean with the same name as the property that needs to be auto wired. So in the bean you are going to define the name, at the same time in the configuration file also you need to define the same name. Then automatically it will be by name it is going to auto wire the dependent objects. And by type, it allows a property to be auto-wide if exactly one bean of the property type existing in the container. So in order to go with the type, you need to make sure that only one type is available as part of the bean definitions in the configuration XML based configuration file. And by type, by type means allows a yeah. So by type, it is basically type means whether it is basically a constructor and the type is almost similar. If the problem is if there is no type is matches, then it is going to throw a fatal exception. It is going to thrown. Now by constructor, so analogous to the type but applies to the constructor arguments. Here by type what happens, it is going to apply for the property, but here it is going to apply for the constructor. If there is not exactly one bean of the constructor archetype in the container, a fatal error is raised. So by type is nothing but it is going to use the setter based dependency injection. For constructor it is going to use the constructor based dependency injection. And finally the question is, what is the purpose of component at service at the rate of component, at the rate of service, at the rate of controller, and at the rate of repository. So controller is basically, it is a whenever you are working with the web application, controller basically tells you that which is going to uniquely identify the particular resource at the server end. Controller always will going to map with the at the rate of mapping, then which is going to uniquely identify the particular service and which will execute a particular functionality on the server. So at the controller where your request mapping from a presentation page is done, and the presentation layer won't go to any other file, it goes directly to the controller class and check for the requested path in the request mapping annotation which written before the method calls if necessary. And then service, all the business layer implementations needs to be annotated with the service. Okay, so that is data related or the calculations and all. This annotation of the business layer in which our user not directly call persistence method. So it will call this method using this annotations. So it will request at repository as per user request. So from the service actually it will go to the repository. So repository is basically you have any classes where you are interacting with the database, then those classes needs to be annotated with the at the rate repository. So this is the persistence layer of the application which is used to get the data from the database layer. That is all the database related operations are done at the repository. And then component, so component is going to be basically annotated any other components along with this component stereotype. For example, if you here component and I want to provide the scope, then these two along with the another component you can use as a component. And whenever you use the component, we have the something called as in the configuration called as a context dot annotations. Then that configuration will read the whatever the components which are either annotated with the at the rate of component or the repository or the service, and which will be taken care by the container. So these are the four important annotations which are used whenever you are working with the Spring framework at the core module level. Hope you clear with the concept. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day.